Welcome to lecture number 13 and chapter number 13, Policies, Standards, and Guidelines. So typical agenda that we'll be following today. First we'll be going into the last lecture in the chapter review, what happened in the last chapter. Then I will summarize what the lecture and chapter objectives are for this chapter. And then we'll get into the lecture itself and we'll summarize with a set of review questions that you can pull from the book that will help you for the quizzes and such. So the last lecture and chapter in review, in the last lecture what we talked about the different sources of information within popular operating systems. And we talked specifically about how can you extract this information from specific systems such that you can do incident response and start to analyze the different methods that attackers have used to infiltrate your systems and so on. We've also created timelines indicating the pattern of an event. And we've also provided examples of evidence of attacks on multiple applications. In this chapter, we're going to take a little bit of a turn and we're going to get more into the policy side of things. So throughout the course, we've talked a lot about the technical aspect, and we talked a lot about the different types of threats and vulnerabilities, assets, and controls that an organization can employ. But those are all very technical in nature, and they really rely on a good set of policies that are implemented from an organizational level, such that the organization knows exactly what they want to execute and how they want to execute it. So we're going to understand the difference between security and compliance requirements. So security requirements and compliance requirements are a little bit different. You may be in a particular industry that dictates that you have to have a set of compliances specific to that industry. We're going to debunk the difference between policy, standards, and procedures, and these three terms are often used synonymously with each other, but they're very different things. We're going to understand the life cycle of a policy and identify a set of policies considered a must for any organization. So this lecture and next lecture are going to be very managerial in nature. It's going to be a lot more text driven, just purely because there's not as much technical work associated with this. It's more of a how do you set the policies that are appropriate for your organization such that everybody can have the appropriate technical implementation in place to ensure a good cybersecurity posture. So the guiding policies or guiding principles for policies that for administrative mechanisms used in the industry to guide end user behavior. So policies, standards, and guidelines are actually three different sets of documents. Policies are documents that records a high-level principle or course of action that has been decided on. A standard is a defined set of rules accepted and adopted by several organizations. So it's not just something that is done within one organization. And guidelines are recommendations for operations. They're not, the letter of the law. They're not, gospel or anything like that. But they are the recommendations that you can use to operate and conduct your operations. And these mechanisms help obtain executive level endorsement for information security objectives within the organization. And the key thing here is that you want to make sure that you get the executive level endorsement for specific InfoSec objectives or InfoSec investments within the organization. One way you can go about doing that is by having the appropriate policy, standards, and guidelines in place. And what these will also help them do is translate the objectives into specific actionable items for all organizational members. So the general workflow that's available or that guides these particular policy standards and guidelines is that security administrators, whether it be sysadmins or more specialized security roles, will recognize the need for change with regarding to information security. So there could be phishing attacks that have been on the significant uptick within the organization. So they'll recognize that there needs to be a change, whether it be in the training policies or so on, for phishing policies. Suggested changes are brought to the attention of top management for review. So the top management is also going to be concerned with things about usability and training costs, because top management isn't necessarily going to be as technical as the lower level folks within the organization. The strategic, the operational and the tactical level security administrators within the organization. They're not going to be as in touch with the specific technical details as they are. However, they are going to have a better idea in terms of the usability of those particular proposals as well as the cost associated with them, and they're ultimately going to be the ones that are going to be signing off. And the change is allowed only by the top management only if it's warranted. And the resulting information security practices are released as policies. Standards and guidelines emanate from these policies. So this is very important. The policies come first, and then the standards and guidelines come after. So, moving forward with the guiding principles, the policy, standards, and guidelines need to be targeted and have to have clear objectives. This is very important. Without this, there's going to be a lot of questioning that comes up as to why certain things are in place and the intent behind them. They also need to have clear objectives. If you think about the lectures that I deliver or the assignments that I provide, at the beginning of each of those assignments or the beginning of each of the lectures, what I do is I summarize what are the targeted areas that I'll be covering in that particular lecture or in that assignment. It has to have clear objectives. So I tell you up front, what are the objectives of the lecture? What are the objectives of the chapter? And from there, everything else starts to emanate. You're able to go ahead and identify the questions that you're going to be answering, how you're going to be answering it with your partner, how you are going to be researching certain questions, how are you going to be structuring the questions, and that type of thing. So it's important to understand the basic principles of information security, and this is something that all of you have a good understanding of, whether it be the threats and vulnerabilities and security controls and that type of thing. These types of things are very, very important and valued by organizations. And use of these principles as underlying support of information security policy. So really, the fundamentals is something that you're always going to be coming back to. This is something that my father and I talked about extensively, is that when I was younger, he said that don't overcomplicate things. Just stick with the fundamentals, stick with the principles, stick with those basic principles that you learned, and then let everything emanate from there. Don't try to overcomplicate things. There's going to be a set of security controls that are associated with user management. Don't overcomplicate them. Implement them accordingly. Do the basic stuff very, very, very well. Don't overcomplicate the basic things. So the basic principles of information security, this is going to go on for the next few slides, is that the organization must comprehend that security affects the organization and its employees and customers on a daily basis. So you cannot do security today, skip it tomorrow, and try it again next week. You have to have something that's going to be in place, that's ongoing. And sound principles of security must be embedded in any and all activities in the organization. So really, it's not something that, oh, we took care of it, we don't need to worry about it anymore. No, it's something that's ongoing and it needs to be dealt with on a daily basis. Now, the reason for this is that attackers move their techniques and their tools and their practices at such a staggering rate. So making sure that you're moving at a quick rate compared to them is also very important. So it's something that you need to take in mind every single day. Second, there's what's called layers of security, and some people refer to it as defense in depth. There's no one-size-fits-all solution for security problems, and this is something that is very, very important. I keep in touch with a lot of industry folks that are working in the field of information security. One of my friends, she works at a major healthcare organization, and what she had shown me was that a lot of the security policies that they're putting in place, or a lot of the security technologies they're putting in place, they're just off the shelf. However, there's no one-size-fits-all for all security problems. You must know your organization. You must know what are the different types of things that you're looking at within your organization. That's part of the reason why I put in the assignments, choose an organization that you're interested in, or think about your organization. I really want you to think about the particular organization that you're going to be working at or that you're currently at, such that you can present something that's of value to them. It's not just one size fits all. Just simply programming a firewall would be just a technical task, but it's understanding what is the intent behind it. So there's no single solution that solves all of the security problems. There's going to be repeated incidents of virus outbreaks, data leaks, and website defacements, and so on. So it's useful to implement multiple security systems, and these security systems have to be carefully considered based on the assets that you have within your organization. Hence why we went through that asset identification process in one of the earlier chapters. And you're hoping that one of these systems can catch the threat action. So protecting data in a file server. So you have a login system with complex passwords, you have biometric scans, firewalls, EPP, and encryption. And these are multiple security systems that are put in place such that the attacker will be stopped at one of these stages. The third key set of basic principles of information security is that understand other positions of the firm. So different approaches may bring up different policy requirements. It helps with the writing of policy. So what are the different types of approaches that your organization likes to take? And this is getting back to, do you understand your organization? So does your company prefer open source or commercial software? This becomes particularly important, say, if you're deploying websites. If you have open source software, you have to make sure that you have the expertise to maintain it accordingly. There's not going to be ongoing updates to like commercial software, say like Microsoft, for example, right? Open source software may have updates from the developers that's up to a certain extent, but they may stop. Many of the technologies that I use that are open source actually were stopped maintained in 2010. So I got to either maintain them myself, or I got to rely on other community updates, which may not be as regular as, say, something like commercial software. Second, does the company adopt one of the industry standards across the board, or is it more selective on what it adopts? There may be situations in larger organizations where there are going to be different business units, and each of those business units are going to be adopting a set of standards for that particular business unit. Third, does the firm hire temporary consultants, or does it strive to keep knowledge in-house? And this is particularly important in the way that you manage users and access control within an organization. If you have temporary consultants that are off-site, right, you have to implement certain mechanisms to make sure that they are actually associated with their organization, and at the time of their removal from the organization, they have been revoked all of their privileges accordingly. Now, policy, from the COBIT framework, a policy is a document that records a high-level principle or course of action that has been decided on. And emphasis is on high level. It's not supposed to be super, super specific. These policies reflect the principles endorsed at the highest levels of the organization. Executive time at these levels is very expensive. So these executives will try very hard not to revisit an issue a second time. You know, my interactions with some of these executives shows that they want to just know what they need to know. And if you can't communicate your point very quickly, they're not going to be very happy. So you want to make sure that you are communicating your point very quickly, very efficiently, get to the bottom line very quickly. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult for them to comprehend, and they're not going to want to put in more time than what they need to. Because at that point, at the executive level, they're getting paid a lot of money, and a single hour can cost them a significant amount of money. So the policies, because of this, are written in general terms. This is because they want to avoid a revisit as a result of routine developments in business and technology. So it has to be written in a high-level way such that it's flexible enough to the evolving nature of technology. Other administrative mechanisms emanating from policies provide specific actionable directions to the employees. So one of the things that comes from policies is that how will employees actually behave as part of this policy? And we'll get into some of these, some examples in the next few slides. They're written by experts such as systems administrators. They can change the specific circumstances within the organization change. So policy, like I said, it specifies a general direction for the organization to follow without concerns of how to get there. Standards, guidelines, and procedures focus on how to get where the policy desires to go. So it's a little bit more fine-grained. So for instance, we have the policy, USF Policy 0516. It's the SSN Appropriate Use Policy. And it reads as follows. Paper and electronic files containing Social Security numbers will be disposed of in a secure fashion in accordance with the state and federal retention and disposal policies. So what you'll notice here is that there's no detail on how to dispose of the paper containing the SSN. Only that it's done in a secure fashion according to the law. Now, why is this important? It's because the focus of this particular policy is that the records are disposed in accordance or in a secure fashion in accordance with state and federal retention. So it doesn't talk about how the disposal is implemented, because that would make it very time sensitive. There might be a way to dispose it in the past that we don't dispose of it now. So that would depend on the technology, available cost, and so on. Now, all the policy is saying is that we need to dispose of it in a secure fashion in accordance with state and federal retention and disposal policies. So this is giving the flexibility such that if there's a new technology that comes up or a different accordance that comes up based off of the state and federal retention, we'll still be safe. So the executives don't need to go back and revisit this because this is very, very flexible for organizations such as USF to implement. Now, the technology available and the costs and so on will be defined in the standards, procedures, and guidelines. So the standards, which emanates from the policies, is a defined set of rules accepted and adopted by several organizations. Some standards are referred to as industry standards, and these include activities, settings, and measurements and so on that are accepted by all firms in an industry, and should be considered the norm for operations. Now, NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, is one of the foremost sources for standards in terms of IT security, and they have things like the NIST framework and so on. Now, this is within the United States. In terms of outside of the United States, I'm not as familiar, but NIST documents are usually labeled as recommendations or guidelines, but they're seen as de facto standards for all organizations in the U.S. As seen throughout the text, including guidelines for conducting risk assessments. So you're seeing stuff like this already. This is guidelines for conducting risk assessments. This is something that's put out by NIST. Now, continuing with standards, there's also an organization called the ISO, International Organization for Standardization. This is more at an international level. Another organization accepted worldwide to produce standards with international scope. The widely used ISO standard is ISO 17799/27002. It deals with information security. The ISO website reads ISO 27002 as establishes guidelines and general principles for initiating, implementing, maintaining, and improving information security management in an organization. The objectives outlined provide a general guidance on the commonly accepted goals of information security management. And from the ISO website, the reading says it contains the best practices of control objectives and controls in the following areas of InfoSec management. This includes security policy, organization of InfoSec, asset management, human resources security, physical environmental security, communications and operations management, access control, information systems acquisition, development, and maintenance, InfoSec incident management, business continuity management, and compliance. And standards are mandatory once it's accepted by the organization. So the key thing is that getting it accepted from the organization and having it emanate from the policies. So for example, the ISO 27002 compliant organization. The organization must adhere to all regulations put forth by the standard. There's no such thing as partial compliance, saying that I only want to comply to certain aspects of it. There's also semantics IT control reference, which you can access here. It maps the requirements amongst various security standards. Now, an organization won't just adhere to one set of standards sometimes. They may have to adhere to multiple sets of standards. And this may be like COBIT, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA, PCI, GLB, and so on. Of course, this relates to the firm product offerings to the requirements. So what does a firm actually offer in terms of products? What are their core services and product offerings that will help dictate what sorts of standards they need to adhere by? And remember, standards are directly related and backed up by policies. They emanate from the policy. So for example, a standard specifies which EPP should be installed, and the policy should declare that all computers in the organization should have endpoint protection solution installed. It doesn't tell you which endpoint solution to be installed. That's something that's the job of the standards. So if we delineate the difference between a policy and standard further, usually a policy is harder to modify than a standard. It needs top management approval. And that is often very costly to do. So allowing IT or other designated units to maintain the EPP standard allows designated units to make decisions. It empowers them to make the decisions. And this goes without the burden of going through the entire policy lifecycle and approval, which we'll get into in later slides. Standards make a policy meaningful. Without a standard, the EPP becomes vague. So in that example that we saw, EPP is a collection of applications. It almost always includes an antivirus solution, And the following are options: host-based intrusion detection, firewalls, vulnerability assessment, and so on and so forth. Without the standard, the units would have a hodgepodge of solutions, but the standard determines an importance and forces implementation accordingly. An example that I could provide is, say, the famous restaurateur Gordon Ramsay. He would actually set the policies at his level in terms of what he'd like to see within his restaurants across the world. He has over, I think 24 restaurants across the world, and he has so many of them. But he'll set the policies himself in terms of having fresh food, preparing the food a certain way, and that type of thing. But then each of the individual restaurants will implement the appropriate standards such that they organize it in a certain way and so on. So you can think about it in that fashion, is that the policies are set by the upper management, and they allow the flexibility for the individual, people who are in charge, such as the systems administrators, or in the case of Gordon Ramsay, who was in charge of the restaurants at each level, to have the flexibility to make the decisions that they need to implement them accordingly, and making sure that it's all standard across the board. Now, procedures that specify what would be nice in an operation or accomplish it, but is not a requirement, is often referred to as a guideline. It's like would be nice to have. Some guidelines may later evolve to be standards depending on when the management finds the utility and grants authority for guideline to become the standard. So if we take a look at this, at all three, we've got the policy, standards, and guidelines. The policies, they're mandatory. It sets the general direction, and it's approved and backed by management. The standard is also mandatory, but it's not general. It builds on what the policy has with specifics. And the guidelines are, you can think about it, they're voluntary adoption, they're pre-standard, so that before they even get to the standard level, and they outline the optional items that's not directly listed within the standard. Now, the question is, why is there so much paperwork? This is a typical complaint. This is something that I often have as well. Why is there so much paperwork that's here? And students, they a lot of times, students and myself as well, is that we have stars in our eyes. We're very optimistic. Why can't we all just get along together? And that's something that I say as well. Why can't we just all get along together? But that's just not the case. Everybody has differing viewpoints, and everybody from their perspective believes that they're right. So they may believe that the best implementation of an intrusion detection system has to come from a certain company, and that just, somebody else may disagree for very valid reasons. Technical personnel are generally very hands-on, but they often have very poor documentation skills because they're often trying to get the latest and greatest technology and keep up with the attacks that are going on within an organization. But documenting guiding principles can actually improve an organization's functioning. It's not just added red tape and bureaucracy. It really isn't. It goes beyond compliance. But the key thing is that it has to be done correctly. The intent behind the policies and the standards and the guidelines have to be done appropriately. Otherwise, it is going to become very bureaucratic. It's going to become very political. It's going to become just a big waste of time for a lot of people. So getting into the benefits, the first benefit is that security policies indicate to the customers, end users, and employees that an organization takes security seriously. There's a face value associated with these policies. Having these policies in place will make sure that the organization is viewed as taking information security very seriously, and that's very important in today's climate, especially when you see things like GDPR and whether or not organizations are taking privacy policies very seriously. Making sure that the privacy policies that are in place within an organization is very important. Same thing with security policies. So for example, the city of Tampa, Florida security policy reads as providing you with secure online experience is a high priority of the city of Tampa. We recognize that your information security is of utmost importance, and we have devoted a great deal of effort to ensure your personal information is safeguarded. So what this indicates is that the importance the organization places on information security. And this should be reassuring to concerned users. I myself find this very reassuring because it's important for me to know that the city of Tampa is actually taking the security seriously. The second benefit is that it provides a roadmap for employees. So the first one is really looking external to an organization, but the second one is how do we actually look at it from from an internal point of view for employees. So the roadmap for employees, so you think about the acceptable use policy, or the AUP. It describes the user's do's and don'ts of the system, things that are acceptable to do as well as things that would cause an end to services or employment. So for example, from AT&T's IP services AUP, threatening material or content. IP services should not be used to host, post, transmit, or retransmit any content or material to create a domain name or operate from a domain name that harasses or threatens the health or safety of others. In addition, for those IP services that utilize AT&T provided web hosting, AT&T reserves the right to decline to provide such services if the content is determined by AT&T to be obscene, indecent, hateful, malicious, racist, defamatory, fraudulent, libelous, treasonous, excessively violent, or promoting the use of violence or otherwise harmful to others. Again, this indicates the importance the organization places on information security. This is very clear, but it also provides AT&T the flexibility to judge what they consider to be hateful, malicious, racist, so on and so forth. And it should be reassuring for concerned users as well. The third benefit that comes out of these policies, guidelines, and standards is that policies force organizations to determine the value of the information they generate in support of actual assets. Sometimes it may be advantageous to make this determination and document it in some case of litigation. So for example, MIT has the following paragraph on their policy of retention of DHCP logs. The DHCP server is configured to provide dynamic addresses automatically as needed. The logs of the information are maintained on an IS&T managed server. Each log is tagged with the creation date once a day, and the system deletes logs that are 30 days old. Organizations tracking the violation of copyright laws must notify the organization within 30 days, in the case of MIT, of the event detection. So it forces the organizations to determine the value of the information that they generate in support of actual assets. Number 4 is policies ensure consistency across the organization. It can yield to better pricing, knowledge acquisition, and so on. So there's a certain level of standardization that is there. You can compare each college having their own EPP solution. The School of Architecture may decide that EPP is a waste of funds and may not purchase any. College of Engineering may install a low quality EPP because they trust their own expertise. And the College of Fine Arts may pay a large amount of licensing fees for EPP. Each school may need consulting help for their own version of the software. So in this case, it would add cost significantly. However, with standardization, one college may send an employee for training and other colleges share the same cost. So it becomes a lot more standardized across the board. The policies become a lot more standard in terms of what's being implemented at each college level. The fifth benefit of policies is that you can get management backing. If it's developed the right way, the policies reflects the concerns and inputs of all affected units and stakeholders. It greatly improves the acceptance of any constraints imposed by the policy. Individuals cannot allege ignorance of the policies, so it's something that's widely accepted by the entire organization. So for example, an organization that has a policy that computers not updating their virus definitions will be pulled off the network. The user would have no recourse to complain if his computer is pulled off the network due to this reason. So because there's management backing, there's widely accepted views on how things operate. So those are the 5 major benefits of policies in terms of why they're there. I agree, it's a lot of red tape. It's not necessarily a lot of red tape, but it's a lot of paperwork. It's a lot of work that's there, but if it's done correctly, it can actually have significant benefits to an organization, both from the outside perspective, like making sure that your stakeholders know that you are taking information security seriously, as well as from an internal perspective, reducing costs, being able to make sure that the employees have a roadmap, and so on and so forth. Now, if you think about how policies actually work, they work in cycles. But it's much like the incident response cycle that we covered in previous lectures. In fact, incidents are often the driving force that helps create a new policy or revise an existing one. So for example, what we talked about in the first lecture, in the late 90s there were massive outbreaks of Melissa and the I Love You viruses. It drove the creation of centralized security policies for decentralized university organizations and the naming of information security officers for universities. So audience for a policy is separate and distinct. There are employees and customers, state or federal regulation. Ideally, policies address both audiences, and ideally they should both share similar concerns. Policy recommendations don't use legal language unless you absolutely have to. Employees and customers should clearly and quickly state the intent of the policy. What is the reason behind the policy? What is the objective behind the lecture? I should be able to quickly articulate that to you. Unclear policies will only addresses regulatory compliance. So becomes a policy for the sake of a policy. It's essentially just marking off a checkbox. Hey, we did this. We had this event. We had this done. But you need to actually have an idea of what's going on in it. If you just have the policy for the sake of a policy, no one's going to read it. Everyone has a vague idea about what it's about. Each policy should be targeted at a specific issue as far as possible. So for example, there should be one for data protection, another one for user access, another for user backup, and so on. It satisfies regulatory compliance, and users will have an easier time finding what they're looking for. Policy requirements on one end have to be strong enough to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of assets. On the other end, they must maintain productivity for competitiveness. So the reality is that there's a defensive stance of management. Many organizations err on the side of protection, and there's an aggressive stance of employees. Employees focus on their careers. They're aware of the importance of productivity. They will be dedicated to doing their job or achieving their goals. If a policy prohibits their required activity or behavior, employees will find a way around it. And many employees are very guilty of this. They may say that they don't believe that the certain policy that the management has put in place is appropriate, and they don't think it's worthwhile or something to that effect, and they'll just find a way to get around it. So you need to make sure that the policy is something that the employees will actually abide by. So the stages of the policy cycle is that there's writing the policy, impact assessment and promulgation, and reviewing. So in writing the policy, we have the initial development by the experts, impact assessment and promulgation is reviewed by the stakeholders, and the review is a periodic reevaluation. So with writing the policy, follow an organization template if it exists. Otherwise, search online for similar policies within the industry. Chances are, if you're new within an industry, within a well-developed industry, you're going to be able to find some of these policies that are out there. If you're starting a completely new industry, then you can set the tempo for the rest of the industry. And this will help you make sure that you cover as many subtopics as possible. So a generic template is presented here. The components of a typical policy has an overview, scope, definitions, statement, and enforcement. So the overview is the first section of the policy. It tells the users why the organization have decided to have such a policy. So an example from my alma mater, the University of Arizona, the general security policy is university resources, information, and technology become increasingly important to faculty, staff, students, and academic and administrative purposes. At the same time, internal and external threats to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of these resources have increased. Security breaches are commonplace, and universities continue to be popular targets for attack. Critical university resources such as research, patient care, business transactions, student and employee, non-public personal data must be protected from intrusion and appropriate use or disclosure. Devices must be set up and routinely maintained and updated so they prevent intrusion and other malicious activities. So that's the overview. And then the purpose is clearly stated as well. The purpose of this policy is to ensure that all individuals within the scope understand their responsibility in reducing the risk of compromise and so on and so forth. So you can continue to read the rest of what's in there. Now, in the overview, what you want to look for is the first paragraph. The university will outline that they value their institutional data. They'll give you a glimpse of some of the issues covered in the policy. The second paragraph, go back to some of the guiding principles we discussed earlier. Security is not the job of the IT alone. Securing personal data is a responsibility of each individual. It also sets up for the enforcement piece. Access is not a right due to the paying of their tuition, but it's a privilege. And abuses of these privileges can have consequences. So the scope tells the user what or who is covered by the policy. Every policy has a scope associated with it. So for example, the workstation security policy at Emory College. The workstation security policy is applicable to all workstations such as Windows, Mac OS X, Linux, including desktops, portables, and virtual machines that fall under the administrative scope of ECCS. The second example is the incident management policy at Kansas State University. These procedures apply to all university personnel units and affiliates with responsibility to respond to security incidents involving university IT resources or data. So the scope, what to look for, in the case of Emory College, the organizations must be careful not to overspecify the target of a policy. So Windows, Mac OS X, and Linux create a loophole. But what about a faculty member running an older Solaris desktop workstation? It's not covered by the policy. The solution for this is add other operating systems to the end of the list. Now what this does is that it creates a situation where there's no loophole actually. It covers all your bases. In the case of Kansas State University, it includes data and very clear lines of responsibilities. It includes employees and affiliates of the university every time institutional data is involved. So it's not specifying which type of data, it's just saying institutional data. And it says all employees and affiliates of the university. So it becomes very generic but specific at the same time. The definitions are particularly useful when the subject matter of the policy may be unclear to the audience, or if the organization needs a bit more clarification on the scope. So Georgetown's definition of the EPHI, Electronic Protected Health Record, is listed here. And the second one, Marist College of Definition of Information Resources. For the purpose of this policy, information resources refer to all Marist computer hardware, software, communications equipment, and so on and so forth. All hardware, software, communications equipment, and associated storage and peripherals that store and transmit information that become to Marist College. All data, information, and intellectual property that may be transmitted or stored on any Marist information resource, any paper reports, and so on and so forth. So it's a very, very specific definition as to what they consider to be information resources. For definitions, what to look for is in the case of Georgetown, it specifies what is considered to be EPHI. It also provides some clear examples of what is not considered to be EPHI, such as student records. Marist College, a popular term used in IT policies, is information resources. But what is an information resource? You know, it could be all of these different things, but in Marist policies, the word information resources unquestionably refer to the defined assets that were listed right here. The statement of a policy formulates how the organization will deal with a particular situation. So for the first example, the University of Massachusetts Boston wireless requirements and procedures talks about the wireless access points, the WAPs, and the Purdue's data security and incident response policy. So the statement of a policy is what to look for. Is say in the University of Massachusetts it addresses the problem of a rogue wireless access point. Individuals walking around campus could associate with a WAP accidentally, and sniffing attacks are possible, a la TJ Maxx. In the case of Purdue, as much as possible, the statement of the policy should also outline the responsibilities for implementing the policy. Example is one of several statements specifying the responsibility of the coordinator of incident response. And the statements of policy vary in lengths. It depends on the subject matter and also the organization's choice of grouping multiple issues into one policy or splitting them up into multiple policies. Enforcement specifies the penalties for violation of a policy. So not everybody's actually going to adhere to the policy, but there needs to be the appropriate reprimands in place such that the policy is enforced. And it's usually this last section of the policy. It may refer to other policies for penalties. So there may be other policies that are in place that are dedicated to penalties. And it's rarely specific in the penalty. Usually mentions ranges of possible measures, using phrases such as up to and including and appropriate measures. Also tends to use may instead of more of a shall or must. Shall or must are commonly used in the rest of the policy. So enforcement, let's talk about USDA. It's a little bit shorter here. Violations of standards, procedures, or practices in support of this policy will be brought to the attention of management officials for appropriate action which will result in disciplinary action, and that could include termination of employment. So in the case of USDA, instead of specifically stating what anyone does and this will be fired immediately, it softens the blow up to termination of employment. So it gives that kind of flexibility to the management in case that the policy is not adhered to. So it gives the management officials the appropriate leeway to determine the penalties. And sometimes a simple slap on the wrist may be enough to comply with the policy. There's also something called an impact assessment. A review of a written policy by all affected stakeholders is strongly recommended. The draft of a policy is circulated through stakeholders and feedback is requested. One question was posed to stakeholders: does the new policy or change in existing policy have an impact on their department, beneficial or otherwise? It allows the comparison of impacts of failure to pass new policy with passing policy. Impact assessment requires governance, a hierarchy of decision-making authority within the organization. The governance reflects the committees or groups that have the ability to veto a policy before it becomes official. An example is the University of Michigan. In their policy impact assessment, they say the following identifies the different levels of governance review and vetting of policy standards and guidelines, initially drafted by the IT Policy Development Working Groups. So the CISO/IIA Executive Director, initial review of policy guidelines and standards. IIA Council is first level of governance of review for IT policy standards and guidelines, and so on and so forth. So it provides the exact hierarchy for the decision-making authority within the organization in terms of what their responsibilities are. And other levels of approval may be involved before the policy becomes official. So we've drafted up the policy, it's going through multiple rounds with the folks that were listed above. But other levels of approval may be required beyond what's provided there. So an example is a state university, the faculty members may have a say on the policy, student organizations may also have a say, and so on. Therefore, some organizations have policy groups with cross-campus representation, responsible for reviewing and approving or rejecting policies. Other universities handle policies within the Office of General Counsel. So for example, in Cornell University, they'll actually be specifying it within the UPO of their organization. And the points to note: the existence of a UPO, the University Policy Office. The UPO handles the mechanics of policy promulgation process. The existence of a PAG, a Policy Advisory Group, cross-functional group responsible for policy approval. So this is specific for Cornell. At Cornell, the PAG meets from time to time to make policy decisions. At other universities, the vetting process may be done over email with deadline for comments to be brought forth. And impact assessment, there could be significant delays associated with impact assessment. So it's going through multiple levels. Some people may just forget to open up the email on their machine and so on. And hence, the technical details should be left out of policies as much as possible. Refer to a standard for those technical details. It puts the IT organization in charge of the standards, such as the minimum password length, supported operating systems, and so on. And dynamic IT teams can be modified quickly with just internal reviews. And the benefits of impact assessment for a policy is it prevents policy revision to deal with employee resistance, it prevents waste of time in policy promulgation, and it prevents the erosion of credibility with the top management. So it's really a measure twice, cut once type of situation. You want to make sure that that policy is set, it goes through the appropriate levels of review, such that all of the stakeholders that are affected by this policy have a chance to review it accordingly. And this helps prevent the policy revision, it prevents waste of time, and it prevents the erosion of credibility with top management. So policy review is a reevaluation of benefits of a policy, and the common triggers are periodic review, technology changes, regulatory changes, and so on. A periodic review, if a policy is 10 years old, does it meet with the current requirements of the institution? If not, does this reflect a systematic negligence on the part of IT? So the rule of thumb is that internal review of all policy standards and guidelines at least once a year. You want to make sure that everything is being reviewed such that it matches up with what you're seeing within your organization from a workflow perspective. And time to evaluate whether a policy accounts for all situations. So technology changes. Ideally, a policy was written in a way such that new technologies may be addressed in the standard. So for example, implicit references may exist to paper-based forms. New project deployments may require policy modifications. So for example, changes in workflows for approvals. Regulatory changes, we can take for example the Higher Education Opportunity Act of 2008. It forced universities to take a stance against illegal sharing of copyrighted materials such as movies or songs, and imposed 3 general requirements on all U.S. colleges and universities. The first one being the annual disclosure to students in describing copyright law and campus policies related to violating copyright law, a plan to effectively combat the unauthorized distribution of copyrighted materials by users of the network, including the use of one or more technology-based deterrents, and a plan to offer alternatives for illegal downloading. So these are 3 general requirements. It provides enough flexibility for the organizations while simultaneously providing the direction that the organizations need to go in. And failure to comply could result in massive financial losses for the university in terms of financial aid funds. And changes in compliance resulted in change of operations which had reflective changes for existing policies. So compliance, policies help organizations meet requirements. It's called compliance. Compliance is not the same thing as security though. Compliance is simply following the specifications put forth by policies or legal requirements, and often do not clearly address the reason for the requirement. Security is being free from danger. Possible to be secure without being compliant. So you may not actually be compliant, but you want to make sure that you're secure. Existing infrastructure and budget may prevent compliance. So if we look at what compliance is composed of, there's internal policies, organization policies, state laws, customer agreements, and federal law. You must be compliant with all of them accordingly. And compliance helps meet the needs of all sources shown in the figure. Ideally, it should reflect the best practices discovered in other organizations and can prevent wasted effort by IT. So it's being efficient, being very thoughtful about the way that you are actually being compliant. And compliance is useful if considered to be considered from the planning stages of any endeavor. So if you think about it from the beginning stages of any organizational endeavor, so you want to get into Bitcoin or something like that, right? You want to make sure that you're compliant with any of the policies that are in place or any of the laws that are associated from the get-go. You don't want to go through and do what you want to do from the start and then realize that you have to be compliant in different ways. It could actually scale back your operation significantly and have an impact in terms of the way that you are operating your business. And there's various laws to the state, so for example, the California Breach Notification Law, the Florida Record Retention Law, and so on. And then there's also federal ones, such as SOX, HIPAA, GLB, and so on. And some laws are directly related to IT, and the compliance makes sure that you're compliant with them accordingly. So for example, the California Breach Notification Law. Companies that collect personal information to notify each person in their database should there be a security breach involving personal information of their social security number, driver's license number, account number, credit or debit card number, or security code or password accessing their financial account. Others are indirectly related to IT. So for example, Florida's record retention laws establish minimum periods of time for which the records must be retained based on the records' administrative, fiscal, legal, and historical values. And summary of important federal laws follows. So there's HIPAA. It specifies a privacy rule, which is Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Protections for personal health information held by covered entities. Gives patients an array of rights with respect to that information and permits the disclosure of personal health information needed for patient care and other important services. It also specifies a series of administrative, physical, and technical safeguards for covered entities to use to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of electronic protected health information. Other ones are the GLB Act, known as the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, or the Financial Modernization Act. What it essentially requires a financial institution to do is protect the privacy of their customers. You can see why this would be so important in an information age. So in the case of like Chase or Bank of America or Wells Fargo, making sure that they are actually protecting the privacy of their customers. And the universities also deal with a variety of financial records from students and their parents. So the universities have a responsibility to secure the personal records of its students. Technically, I am not allowed to share your grades with not only other students, but also with your parents, because you have a right to those particular set of privacies. And there's two rules. There's a safeguards rule, which companies must develop written information security plan that describes the program to protect customer information. So that's something that's very important. That's dictated by the GLB Act. And then there's also the privacy rule. Another important federal law is FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. It protects the privacy of student education records. So similar to what I discussed about the grades, right? The schools may disclose without consent a directory of information such as the name, address, telephone number, date and place of birth, honors awards, and dates of attendance. But schools must tell parents and eligible students about directory information and allow eligible students a reasonable amount of time to request that the student not disclose the directory information about them. So we can actually make sure that that information is not disclosed if it's not of interest. And the schools must notify parents and eligible students annually about their rights under FERPA. There's also the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, and it introduced significant changes to corporate reporting. It passed in the wake of numerous corporate scandals. So for example, if we think about Enron, for example, right, just basically cooking the books. And it holds top executives personally responsible for the accuracy of companies' financial data under threat of criminal prosecution. And it popularized general information technology control, such as security administration, data backup, change control, and access control. There's also export control laws, such as the international traffic and arms regulations. I won't go into too much depth about this, but just being aware that these laws are in place are very important. Now, common security or policy issues is that there are common issues requiring a policy. One is acceptable use, one of the main policies of an organization. Guidelines to users and customers on what can be done with IT resources. So there may be different AUP for customers and employees. And the second common issue that's often requires a policy is information classification. It outlines the definitions of criticality and sensitivity of assets, which you all have experience doing in past assignments. The examples are important to clarify the intent of the classification, and definitions of data ownership and custodianship are also part of this policy. Other common issues that require a policy is network access. Who gets access to what part of the network? And another one is remote access. Who gets access remotely? Who can access the network from an outside computer? Other ones are encryption. So what type of data requires encryption and what type of encryption is in place? And also contingency planning. So specified disaster recovery plans. It establishes a clear line of command, localized or generalized disaster. So it designates the executive or appropriate person to be responsible for that disaster. It refers to other standards and procedures on the specifics of what to do in case of a disaster. Other policy issues are incident response, right? So we've talked about incident response, and we talked in previous classes. We talked about the importance of having policy in place, and also authentication, authorization. Who gets access to what? Those are all critical aspects in terms of policies as well. So summarizing the lecture, we talked about the difference between security and compliance requirements. Compliance requirements are something that you have to take into account from like the law and then the policies that are in place within and industry standards and so on. We talked about the difference between policy standards and procedures. The policies are a set of, it's a vision from the executives and upper management that will help an organization set the direction in terms of what they need to do, but it's flexible enough such that it keeps up with the time of change with technology and such. Standards provide the exact details of how the policies will be put in place, and the procedures, are also known as guidelines, provide the details in terms of what are the nice to haves. It's not necessarily the what must be done, but it could evolve to a set of standards in the future. We understood the life cycle of a policy, all the way from planning up until implementation and reevaluation and so on. And we identified the set of policies that are considered to be a must for any organization. So there's a set of review questions at the end of the chapter, and as always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks.